Welcome to the Hard Things About Healthcare, where we get into the business and operations of healthcare that clinicians face every day, the challenges they present to delivering care and running clinics, and how they overcome them. The Hard Things About Healthcare is brought to you by Honey Health, the connected care platform for modern healthcare teams. I'm Matt Faustman, type 1 diabetic, and co-founder and CEO of Honey Health.
I'm Ginger Vieira. I've lived with type 1 diabetes for 25 years. I'm a diabetes author, speaker, and content specialist. Dr. Casey Halpern. He is a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist focused on uncovering how the brain governs human behavior and metabolism. He serves as the chief of Stereotactic and Functional Neurosurgery at the University of Pennsylvania. He also leads an NIH-funded lab researching the neural mechanisms underlying addiction, obesity, and psychiatric disease. As co-founder of SynchNeuro, Dr. Halpern is pioneering the use of non-invasive brain signal monitoring to predict and track glucose levels. His work challenges many long-held assumptions in the diabetes space by introducing neuroscience as a tool for metabolic health. Dr. Halpern, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Ginger.
So, as a neurosurgeon and a neuroscientist, what led you to metabolic health?
Well, I have always been interested in how our brain and our metabolism interact. And early on in my career, had an opportunity to watch a deep brain stimulation surgery. This was when I was in college, so some time ago. And that's typically done for things like Parkinson's. And it's been pretty well established through preclinical and clinical research that there's a small area of the brain called the subthalamic nucleus. And if you put a tiny little wire in that nucleus through the brain, kind of like a pacemaker, attached to a little battery in the chest, just like a heart pacemaker, if you stimulate that area, a patient's tremor in their Parkinson's and a lot of the motor symptoms can get better. And when I first saw that, it was in an operating room. The patient was awake. The experience was very dramatic, complete dissipation of the tremor. And the patient started crying just because he finally was able to functionally use his hand, and just couldn't imagine that, because I think he had tremor for at least a decade.
Wow.
And in any case, I'd never really wanted to do anything else. So that's my sort of bread and butter practice now at Penn. But what I do in addition to that is I run a research laboratory exploring how we can use that type of surgery for other problems. And, at the time I was really interested in obesity. And, I saw this procedure called gastric bypass surgery that was highly effective but extremely invasive for patients with obesity, and they would tolerate the surgery well, and the outcomes were very positive, so it seemed reasonable. But I, at the time, really was feeling like the deep brain stimulation procedure could actually be less invasive and more effective. I learned, over a 10 or 15 year career at that point, that when we stimulated different parts of the brain involved in metabolism and feeding control, that we could curb sort of appetite or cravings. And people with obesity, we started in mice, by the way, and really worked out the best target, the mechanisms, got FDA approval, and we're still running a clinical trial now. It's a small study, but we've seen that patients can experience an improvement in their ability to control how much they're eating, and they're losing weight because of that. At the same time, we're trying to figure out, why this is working and what kind of signals in the brain are we controlling. So in a sort of parallel study, we began to look at these signals in the brain that seemed to represent moments when people were going to eat and perhaps overeat or binge. And what we realized was that glucose was an important part of that signal. In fact, glucose was a little lower right before somebody's about to binge. And perhaps there's a little bit of a hypoglycemic predisposition or that's involved in those urges. So sort of an evolutionary urge. If your sugars are low, it's going to make you hungry and it's going to make you crave food.
Speaking to someone with type 1 diabetes, we
Yeah.
work. excuse me, we have to work very hard in type 1 not to overeat when we are having, low blood sugar.
So, perfect sort of, proof of concept there through your own experience. And yes, this is a common problem. And there is probably a brain signal. When you're having that sensation, that signal is very strong. And, signals in the brain are like biomarkers. They're strategies that are used even today to treat problems. The most common example for that is epilepsy. So people with epilepsy have seizures, and we use signals associated with seizures to predict them, to characterize them, to treat them. And so I really tried to find a correlate to these things. Originally it was the tremor cells that I tried to find the correlate of for obesity. And then it was sort of the signals associated with craving related to glucose and hypoglycemia, and the strategies that we use in epilepsy to guide therapies I thought could be very useful for people with diabetes and obesity. Wow. So that's kind of how all of this started. What we realized was the signal related to blood sugar that we discovered in the brain would be emitted throughout the brain surface. It's not just local to one tiny area, like in Parkinson's. It's a diffuse sort of set of signals, and they're on the surface. And we realized not only that, but they follow blood sugar continuously. So it's not just the moment before you eat that your sugar is low that the brain detects that. It's actually the brain continuously monitoring your blood sugar. Sort of like a thermometer, in a bath of water. In this case, the bath is blood, and your brain is constantly surveying it. It has a variety of different kinds of sensors, including glucose receptors, diffusely around the brain. So the brain always knows what your blood sugar is. And there's an evolutionary advantage to that, And if you wonder why, you always go back to evolution to answer that question. That's sort of the scientific strategy there. And there was probably a time in our hunter and gatherer days when if we didn't have that brain mechanism, we would starve. But now we don't necessarily need that in our society, but we still have that biological function.
How would you relate some of that signaling to, so as a type 1, for example, I take a microdose of a GLP-1 medication because of the many hormones that, obviously I don't produce insulin, but there's additional hormones that my body doesn't regulate properly because beta cells aren't talking to the alpha cells and the delta cells, And so that GLP-1 calms down that constant hunger that many people with type 1 feel, along with all the other known side effects of GLP-1s. In people with type 2 and obesity, how would you compare that neuroscience you're describing with the impact of GLP-1s on that signaling?
Well, the role of GLP-1s, as you're alluding to, sort of a microdose, that's becoming very popular. There's also a role, obviously, for GLP-1s as a full dose intervention for people with obesity and type 2 diabetes that induces a similar, sensation with food, and it kind of curbs your appetite and prevents those drives to overeat. And as a result of that and other things, people with obesity lose weight, people with type 2 diabetes see a drop in their A1C, so their glycemic control is better. So there's a lot of overlap here. Obviously, these problems are different, but they all would benefit from sort of better or more comprehensive evaluations or monitors of real-time metabolism. And the real value of the brain for people with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and then type 1 diabetes would be, for example, that the brain is a prediction machine. So we learned that the signals that the brain gives off have a lot of functions and different roles that we can tap into. The first being that we can track blood sugar using brain data, just like a standard, glucose monitor that you probably wear.
Indeed.
Yeah, and it probably has a little needle on it, and it sits in the skin, and I bet you change it every couple of weeks.
I've got one of the newest ones. I have the implantable.
You have the implanted one, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
No more needle for me, but
No more needle.
yeah.
Yeah.
But so that brings me to a critical question. Could you kind of explain to us the technology of, and maybe you were getting there, my apologies, but
Yeah.
could you explain to us the technology of how your device measures glucose levels and then reports that data? And what does the device look like? How is it
Yeah.
used and worn?
Yeah. So the device that we're building, remember I mentioned that the glucose signal that we could detect from the brain was diffuse. It was everywhere. It was on the surface of the brain. When you have surface signals, you can usually capture them with a sort of external sensor. And so, that's basically EEG, which is a modality that's fairly standard in the clinical patient care world for people with epilepsy, people with sleep disorders. Research laboratories use EEG to study the brain neuroscientifically. And we're really, if not the first, one of the first companies trying to develop EEG in a way that masses of the mass populations would use.
Okay.
What we see as an opportunity here is to help people with glucose dysregulation very broadly. That could even be people with prediabetes, which is a very large population, 100 million Americans. It's almost becoming the norm because, for a variety of reasons. But we want to use EEG as sort of a way to scale glucose monitoring.
And using an EEG at home in my everyday life?
Yeah, actually it would be a wearable. So usually EEG is kind of like all around the scalp. That's not something people are going to wear. It's very uncomfortable, unsightly.
You look like an X-Men character.
Yeah, exactly. My daughters would love that, by the way, but most people would not, and that's obviously understandable. So what we did was we started with the standard EEG, obviously, and we were able to reproduce some of the work we did in the brain, in the human brain, but all externally. So we first started in the brain using things like deep brain stimulation electrodes, and then we worked outside the brain and confirmed that we could detect those superficial signals in the brain using an external sensor. Then we downscaled that sensor. So we started with the full scalp array, like the X-Men characters. And then we started looking at electrodes on the forehead, electrodes on the side of the head, electrodes behind the ear. And we were a little lucky. I mean, you have to make your own luck. But we found that the sensor behind the ear actually had the strongest signal. And that's probably because, it's probably because the bone is somewhat hollow there and thin. And so the brain signal is very robust. But the beauty of being behind the ear is that you can't see it. So people can wear our wearable. It's like it's a patchable, it's an adhesive. It's rechargeable. You can charge it once a week. It sits behind the ear. You can think of it, almost looks like a Band-Aid. It's supposed to be skin colored. One day we'll make it a piece of jewelry, but not generation one. And it will continuously, sense your brain signals. It'll Bluetooth connect to your phone. We have our app is our interface with our users. So we've been working, tirelessly on making sure our app is seamless and helpful for people and easy to use. And we'll roll this, product out with the ability to do glucose sensing like your device does. But it will also have a proactive role. So the brain, and this is the value of brain data, you can use brain data to predict to a certain extent what your blood sugar is going to be tomorrow. For example, wake up in the morning, get a prompt from our app with sort of a risk assessment for the day. And if it looks like you're going to have high blood sugars in the context of type 2 or obesity or prediabetes, we'll give you, personalized data-driven advice, all based on machine learning, to try to prevent those spikes from happening, or keep them as short and as blunted as possible.
Is it measuring? How would you compare what it's measuring glucose, the measurements of glucose compared to glucose in interstitial fluid that CGMs are measuring versus blood glucose with a glucose meter?
It's similar but very, very different. I'll try to explain. So, we established this ability of the brain by, our company's name is SynchNeuro. So we synchronized continuous brain data collected continuously with a continuous glucose monitor, which, as your device probably samples blood sugar every 5 minutes. So we had a relatively continuous string of data, both kinds of data, and then we could synchronize them in time. And that allowed us to kind of figure out what brain signals were really related to blood sugar and what weren't.
Okay.
Now we're collecting data, looking to collect, many hundreds of individuals. And once we have that, we would have, a training set for our machine learning algorithm that's optimized and robust. So you can put the device on and it'll track your blood sugar immediately. That algorithm optimization is still sort of the primary priority of the company. We're fundraising to support this right now. But once we have that, kind of like you put a Dexcom on your arm or your belly, obviously doesn't require surgery. You could just put our patch on and it'll tell you your blood sugar. The other value of it is that, it's a brain signal device. So there's a lot of things that we can do. We can give you a sense of your sleep quality. What are you doing during the day to improve it or worsen it? Where are you at? And a lot of people, they're like, I feel like I didn't sleep well last night. Why is that? Or, when was I awake? When wasn't I awake? I was in la la land. Was this a high quality sleep? Was this a poor quality sleep? We can really get into that with people. And, there's wearables that do this pretty well right now. But we can derive, gold standard, medical grade sleep features from the human brain. And, what's really nice with that type of data, you can actually tell somebody with pretty good certainty what your blood sugar is going to be in the morning when you wake up. And that might be a day when you want to avoid a pancake breakfast or have, a little exercise in the morning or something like that. And we would be able to kind of give you those warnings ahead of time.
And I would think that might be a little trickier, the prediction in someone taking insulin manually, right? Because there's the body's not regulating. You're not assessing the body's regulation. You're assessing human regulation of insulin.
Yeah.
Right?
So, we're starting with people with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes that are not on insulin. Our interest is to get our technology out into the world. And, we're applying for FDA clearance for over-the-counter use, kind of like Dexcom and Abbott have now for people that don't have type 1 diabetes and are not using it to guide medication like insulin. But that's just a strategy to get our device out into the world faster. Eventually, our plan is to get to type 1 diabetes and even other medical conditions, because you can glean a lot from brain data that is otherwise not possible. And you can glean so many kinds of data from this one thing. Like your device, it gives you fabulous glucose readings, but that's probably all it can do. Very important for a person with type 1 diabetes, by the way. Not saying that's not valuable at all. But, imagine it could tell you what your heart rate is, tell you your sleep quality, tell you what your blood sugar is going to be when you're sleeping tonight, what it's going to be, in the morning ahead of time. That multifunctionality, we think, could be really helpful for people, and it's only possible if you use a rich data set. And now that we have the ability to kind of pull from that data using a discrete wearable, we think there's a huge need for this type of neurotechnology.
Cool. That's very exciting that it would be this little thing tucked behind your ear that would eliminate a big stigma for a lot of people who, especially prediabetes and newly diagnosed type 2. I don't even have like a chance to care that I've got a device in it, because what it benefits my daily safety makes it obviously worth it, right? But if you have prediabetes, you're not convinced you need to have this weird thing on your arm all the time. And so having that little right behind the ear, that could be really a big deal.
You can take it on and off as you see fit, right? If you take a Dexcom or Abbott device off, you got to throw it out, and that's $50 down the drain. So it's it's a very different type of technology. So we think we can appeal to many people. But you asked a really good question earlier that I want to make sure I answered about insulin as a sort of a confound to what we're doing. Like, it could really confuse the algorithm when people give themselves insulin. And so our plan there, is actually to start with people with type 1 diabetes that have an insulin pump, because now the insulin is getting administered based off of your physiology. I recognize that the insulin is coming from somewhere else, but your brain may or may not know that. So we feel that because there's probably going to be a regularity to that, and we can train the algorithm off of the insulin delivery, we think that would be very feasible, and we could probably improve titrations, make them more accurate, avoid hypoglycemic events, things like that.
In the
But
automated insulin delivery
correct.
systems. Yeah.
But that's, to do that would require a much higher sort of regulatory bar, like a much more in-depth, longer clinical trial to get FDA approval. And we were a little concerned as a very vulnerable startup company that we would not survive the funding climate because it is a tough market right now.
No, I'm glad you're taking that route, because I think the first population you could really serve is clearly prediabetes and type 2s who are not on insulin yet. Insulin's complicated. Stay far away from that until you're really ready, right?
Well, and there's devices that are very helpful, like the one you have, and are we going to be better than that? I think that, it's possible we'll have broader functionality, we'll be more affordable. We think we could be more accurate, but we've got years ahead of us to prove that out. Right now we really want to focus on a population that's not being well treated. People with prediabetes, often they're not convinced they have a problem, and so they don't worry about it, and that's reasonable. Right. But there's a lot of people with prediabetes, it may be a majority, by the way, based on our market research, that feel like the medical world ignores them. They're told they're not sick enough to be seen, or, our wait list is going to be a year before we can see you. And so our goal is to really put health in their hands and give them insights that they otherwise wouldn't have.
Speaking of the FDA, what are some of the biggest barriers that you have already encountered or you're anticipating having to try to work through as a small startup, right? Trying to introduce brand new technology to the field of glucose monitoring.
Yeah. You always have to level set with these kinds of things. Thankfully, I have a lot of FDA experience, and I have a fabulous, FDA consultant and a CEO advisor who's gone through the FDA multiple times. So I don't think we're naive on this one. We're sort of prepared. Most of the FDA experience I have is with invasive devices, invasive brain devices, and so you can imagine they're regulated, to the nth degree, appropriately, obviously. This device is external. It's not guiding medication. It's only lifestyle management. Obviously non-invasive. It is also, similar to devices that are used for things like epilepsy. So there's a predicate available for safety purposes. So we think that we can get 510K approval, maybe de novo. That would be for over-the-counter clearance. So it's not really a full FDA approval. But just FDA clearance, and the precedent for that is like Dexcom and Abbott's over-the-counter approval. Probably using very similar language. We want to go after people that have glucose dysregulation, and there's going to be a wide range of individuals that want this. There could be people that have glucose dysregulation that don't have prediabetes or have polycystic ovarian syndrome. So in any case, we want to make our technology broadly available to those who feel like they need it and want it, and want to have more insights into their health. And the over-the-counter strategy, we see adding no more than 6 months of time in terms of working through the FDA process, pre-submission, running a clinical study, and then getting back to the FDA with the data to get that apply for that clearance. It usually is about a 6-month process.
Okay, cool. I've put CGMs on a couple friends who I suspected, might have prediabetes. And one of them saw enough evidence in that data that he cut his daily soda in half.
Oh, wow.
And he lost about 15 pounds, and he started trying to walk more.
That's great. Yeah. And that is exactly what we're trying to do. The problem, some, investors that we talk to say things like, well, that seems to be working quite well. What's the problem, right? Like what you just said. And that's a great thing that happened, right? But there is still a problem with it. It is a little invasive. It requires a pinprick. Some people have a problem with that, some don't.
Well, and the only
sort of
reason he had access to it is because I gave him an extra one
right,
of mine. Otherwise, he
right,
would have never had access to that technology.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Insurance won't cover it,
No.
and yeah, and it's very expensive.
Yeah.
So our goal is actually to be a mass market product and be available to everybody. So we'll apply for reimbursement through insurance. If we don't get it, actually we think that's okay. The reason for that is because we're only going to charge people $10 a month. It's going to be a
Mm.
subscription service. We're actually going to give our technology away.
Hmm.
It's very affordable to build these types of devices, unlike the device you have, by the way, which is very expensive to make appropriately.
Yeah.
And Dexcom's devices, their gross margins are not very favorable, so they have to charge a lot of money to make it worthwhile. Our technology is very cheap to make. We'll sell it very cheaply. In fact, we're going to just give it away and just have people pay a subscription to join our community and have access to our app.
Well, so you're going to be really generating a lot of continuous data.
Yeah.
How do you plan on making that data really actionable for both the person wearing the device and their healthcare team?
Yeah, so our app will function a lot like the predicate apps out there that guide, what glucose is doing to your body right now, the real-time glucose monitors. That functionality will be there. It'll be, very similar to what you do with a standard glucose monitor on your app, Bluetooth stream from the device. There will probably be a combination that we are still working out of cloud-based and smartphone-based data storage and analytics. And there's different strategies there. They all have, their pluses and minuses. So we haven't finalized that plan quite yet, but there's different options for us at least. And then in addition to that, what we think is sort of our sort of special sauce is that since we are using brain data, we have this proactive, predictive ability, so we can forecast for people what their day is going to be like in terms of blood sugar. So you will wake up in the morning, you'll have a notification on your phone, and that notification will be a results of an analysis, I should say, that shares with you what your risk is that day. What is your glucose sensitivity that day? You might have a really bad night's sleep, and for a variety of reasons. That's probably going to be associated with a really high glucose sensitivity.
Yeah.
And we know that when that happens, sugars spike out of control. So we'll give people personalized instructions on how to get ahead of those spikes before they happen based off of their past data. What did they do in their past that actually mitigated these spikes, relatively speaking?
Would that require them saying like, "Hey, I just went for a walk"?
Yep.
Right. Okay.
There will be interaction with our app such that the machine can continuously learn and personalize. Obviously, there will be a training phase for that, although the real-time glucose ability will be there from the moment you put the device on.
Okay.
So, but you can work with the device over time to give it a sense of your specific analytics. And because we have such a large training set, it shouldn't require a lot of data to do that. In fact, it could work within 48 to 72 hours in that regard.
Okay.
But the real-time glucose data will be there.
Have you ever worn your device and a continuous glucose monitor, a traditional glucose monitor today?
Yes. Many times. Because I'm still practicing, I'm a surgeon, I do a lot of my procedures in MRI. I can't wear them continuously all the time, but I have worn them for at least a couple of weeks. I've tried all of them out. Some are a little bit more comfortable than others, a little sleeker than others. They work very nicely. They've given us a sense of, what the state of the art is and how can we make it better. The president of our company, Emily Murrow, she constantly wears these devices. She's had them on every part of her body. She has become an expert in diabetes technology across the board, both, from the inside out and experiencing it through her own experience as well. So,
and how does that, when you line it up side by side with your device's data, how does that data line up?
It's impressive how well they match. Our training set is growing. It's about a quarter of what I want it to be and what we need it to be to reach peak accuracy. but right now we're pretty much matching what Dexcom is doing.
Okay.
Within a small, error difference, and it's unclear. Are we a little
8%?
better? Are we a little worse? Probably within 85%. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
85% match. Because,
Yeah.
is it a 15% inaccuracy range?
Yeah.
That
12 to 15, something like that.
12 to 15,
So
yeah.
our MARD is probably about a 12.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Hey, that's enough to sell people with diabetes. That's the first
I
question a
agree.
person with diabetes who's educated, right, is going to ask
Yeah.
is, well, how accurate is it, and how
What's
does
the
it
MARD?
compare to my
Yeah.
real blood glucose level?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, we think that actually right now the training set's very nascent, and just with what we have, we're matching Dexcom. It's kind of incredible if you think about where we'll be when we have 500 patients. So, but we're not quite there yet.
Okay. So one more question on kind of in that real clinical care. How do you get clinicians on board with something like this?
Oh.
Because it's so different. And, I also use inhaled insulin, which many
Oh yeah.
clinicians won't even consider. They won't even
Yeah.
consider learning about it for people with
Yeah.
type 1 because it's so different and so new. How
Yeah.
do you explain and get clinicians on board?
I mean, I'm a clinician, so I speak their
Yeah.
I speak their language. Change is hard. I empathize. I have been hard on my colleagues when new devices become available and they're reluctant to change. I'm usually one of the early adopters. I really enjoy innovations, why I'm in the space that I'm in. And I have my threshold to try new things, and patients seem to love new technology. The surgery doesn't change. It's just access to, do you want the iPhone 2 or do you want the iPhone 15, or the 16, the 16 Pro? It's nice to get the latest and greatest, and sometimes there's features that are really helpful for people. So I have always been one of those clinicians that likes to innovate and develop new things, and I certainly worked with clinicians that are reluctant because they're like, well, listen, what's working is working. There's risk to change, and there's costs to change, not necessarily financial costs, but learnings and things like that. So for that reason exactly, we are trying to offer a brain-based glucose monitor that exhibits the same functionality of a familiar Dexcom device, which includes, for example, because this is FDA cleared, or it will be FDA cleared, I should say. I don't want to get ahead of myself. We still have some work to do. I live in the future, though, right? So, but eternal optimist. But the clinicians will be able to bill insurance to evaluate the data, just like they can a standard Dexcom. So they're not going to lose that ability. And obviously, we want them to be reimbursed for their time. We're not going to take that away from them. In addition, the feedback we get from not just patients but also physicians is that they would prescribe these devices more, but even if they prescribe them, the insurances aren't covering it, and if they're not covering it, it's not cost effective. The patients could never continuously wear these things. Doing a little bit more research, and this is where it gets complicated, not to confuse things, but even if insurance covers it, it's still very expensive. So unless you have type 1 diabetes where you really rely on it, Ginger, as you know, it's hard to justify to people financially. And, we always put our health, we never prioritize our health in terms of preventative health. That's just kind of how we are. That's how we're programmed. But imagine that for $10 a month, you could have access to the same, even broader technology that's non-invasive. Even if insurance doesn't cover that, we think that would, that's cheaper than a Netflix subscription, and that's been pretty broadly adopted. So we think that would be a dollar amount that would allow this to scale and help millions of people that need it, not just with diabetes or type 1 diabetes, but also type 2 and prediabetes.
You mentioned 6 months in terms of that FDA clearance submission process. Where are you at? I don't want anyone to think that means you're 6 months out from this hitting shelves. Where are you actually in that journey?
Yeah, it's probably more like a year to 18 months.
Okay.
So we have some optimization to do. We're a early stage startup fundraising now, trying to find seed investor to kind of share our vision and come along for the ride, and write a check or two. We're probably halfway through this fundraising period, I think. We've got lots of interest and enthusiasm, still looking for a lead if anybody's listening, if you know anybody, Ginger. We want to make sure we're finding the right partner that sees the potential here for this type of technology and how it can really scale in ways never really before possible. People have never really thought about, well, what if you could do EEG in 10 million people? No one's really ever thought of that because EEG is this huge cumbersome piece of equipment nobody would ever wear. But if you could wear it, and the signal to noise ratio was favorable, what could you do with it? And once people see our results and they see how accurate and how clean the data is, it's pretty eye-opening, and it's your imagination just starts going as to what you could do with this. But when it comes to metabolism, my gosh, we can shed so much light on things that otherwise would be either very costly or not possible.
Wow. Well, it's going to be very exciting to watch the evolution of this.
Thank you.
We're definitely going to keep an eye on you. Thank you for your time explaining that and for just your own curiosity in trying to solve the bigger problem of helping people with prediabetes easily understand what's going on in their body. That's really the biggest problem, right? Putting it
Absolutely
in their hands in a way that they can be accessed by the mass population and is easy, right?
Yeah.
Hidden behind the ear, the little patch.
We all know that preventative, personalized care is what we all want and need. The issue is putting it into practice. And without a technology like this, it's hard to do that. The health system's not really set up for it, even though that's what everybody wants. Everybody knows we need this. It's just not common practice. So we think that this is where our sort of orthogonal disruption will be.
What's the best place where people can really keep an eye on the evolution of this technology?
Thanks for asking. We try to have a social media presence as much as we can, and keep people updated on our progress, and try to educate individuals on the importance of the brain and our metabolism and why we're doing what we're doing. In addition to that, we do have a website, www.synchneuro.com, sync with an H, like synchronize. On our website, you can join our community, you can follow our progress. We are developing a waitlist for potential users, so feel free to join us and join our community. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you.